Hello, everyone. I'm with Sylvester Wojtkowski, and Sylvester is a clinical psychologist and Jungian psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. He is a founding member of the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association, the JPA, and he teaches nationally and internationally on the subject of archetypal psychology, imagination, and art. So welcome, Sylvester.
Welcome. Thank you for having me on your podcast, John.
I just wanted, the theme we had for today was to take up maybe the multiplicity of the psyche and or what in my language.
Multiplicity of the psyche and multiplicity of the subject or subjects. Or eyes, even better. I not that eye, but the eye that is a subject of the sentence. In that sense.
Well, just as just from where I'm coming from, there's a couple of things. Firstly, I remember reading Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and I think Jung mentions sometime at some place in there. I can't remember the exact quote, but that about the membrane, his membrane being open between the conscious and the unconscious, and then there's some mention of his at that time of the Red Book and the Black Book. He had those conversations with Hillman, the anima figure, and so I can remember getting the feeling of how porous Jung was to these contents of the unconscious or whatever, and those figures that he held. He wrote down the conversations he was having with those figures, and it was kind of like he was very permeable between between those two spheres of what we call the unconscious or whatever. And then secondly, when I began to read James Hillman has said quite a few things that kind of just poetic images that just, hit sometimes. And one of them was, I like to imagine a person's psyche to be like a boarding house full of characters. The ones who show up regularly and who habitually follow the house rules may not have met other long-term residents who stay behind closed doors and who only appear at night. So the psyche is like a boarding house. And I suppose, my initial thing might be is sometimes I don't know, I remember seeing on Facebook, someone said, before I became individuated. So sometimes in some Jungian circles, there's this kind of idea of this unified self, which can be very strong. And then maybe a lot of what I get from James Hillman, or if you go back to Jung in the Red Book and the Black Book, is kind of this polytheism or multiplicity of the psyche. I mean, what do you have to say about all that?
If you look at trajectory of Jung, see, he starts, in his writing, besides, when he is a student, he does his dissertation on his cousin, who is who is in love with him, actually. So she kind of, in this more contemporary jargon, channels these different characters, and he does his medical dissertation on that. From that, he moves towards the experimenting with the complexes. So he actually measures, galvanic skill response, the heart rate, and so on, and the reactions, and creates word association test that is still used in the lie detector test in the sort of the police, I guess, proceedings sometimes. So he becomes very experimental and notices that there are these reactions that people have. The test is you say only one word to the word that the test mentions. So you just say the first word that comes to your mind. And there are a lot of indicators. Sometimes people say different words, sometimes several words, sometimes they just cannot say anything for a while. So that this is the reaction time, how long it takes for a person to associate, salt, pepper, usually people say, or there are other. So he developed a list of 100 words that are, in the process of this sort of experimental test, they're administered to the person, and then you write the response. Measure the time with the, this is also the origin of the stopwatch. Stopwatch comes in with the Swiss, obviously, industry, measure one fifth of a second. So you could, actually, all these early psychological experiments would measure reaction time for anything. How do you feel long it takes to register, being pierced with the needle, and all those kinds of things that they try to measure. So he's exploring that, and he's not interested in how on average it happens, but on anomalies. So you see that suddenly somebody cannot say there's the word wedding, let's say, and somebody cannot say anything for a while and say, I don't know, or something like that, which would be an indication that somebody has what he calls the complex, which is the sense of the emotional tone with different ideas. So it's a kind of a cluster that's like magnet attracts to itself. So there's several words that would constitute that complex. He then finds that the complexes are shared in the families, that the children and parents have similar complexes, and so from this also he builds the idea. And this already he read Freud's interpretation of dreams, and when he sends his research to Freud finds the confirmation of the repression, so he starts in the experimental way. Eventually, he begins to see that the complexes are just, you can see them in action, both like parapraxis, what Freud called, which is like mistakes of speech when you want to say something. If you look at the politicians, it's very interesting to see where they make mistakes, in the sort of formal speech or something, which is also an indication of it. So he moves from this very kind of precise, experimental world towards larger positions. So when he separates from Freud and then goes into his what he calls confrontation with the unconscious, and begins to find out that in search of the soul, he discovered this many characters with whom he has a lot of dialogues. So he encounters, creatures, like starting with the first is a wounded heart. That's the first voice that appears, in the black books, and from that different character, eventually, soul does not appear for 25 days. He does, so he's looking for the soul, but the soul doesn't respond. Only when he's frightened, the soul says that, your fear testifies against me. That's the first statement of the soul. So eventually he goes through the mysterium, meeting Elijah and Salome, and is initiated into kind of deified form, being the ion, the Leoncephalus, being sort of partly Christ, partly this sort of old, Gnostic deity, ion. Or the year, in a way, it's made apparently means 365 days. Right. So and then and Elijah, among this sort of initiation of Jung, talks about that we are not symbols, we are real people. So he slowly, has a lot of trepidation, has a lot of, what Keats beautifully called negative capability. Because he is, in spite of being terrified, being ashamed of what he's doing, he continues. And as he continues, more and more things develop and more characters appear. So so this is like when he's about 37 to, on. Yeah. So he encounters
many years.
Yeah, many figures. And writes down what he sees, or what he, maybe he sometimes writes in a dramatic form. I mean, dramatists do this. Shakespeare have done it. That you write a play, and Macbeth, a Lady Macbeth comes in, and Banquo, and so on. There's a whole world of different characters with different languages and different subjectivities.
Yeah.
So this all people, this inner people eventually. So he starts with the complex. That's a kind of a basically sort of semi-scientific definition of something that is in the psyche. Psyche is made of complexes. He even talks about the ego or the I as an ego complex. So there's certain ideas that are and feeling tones that we identify. Okay, I am now myself. When I woke up this morning, I didn't feel quiet myself, we can say. So it's like something is different than our usual sense of ourselves. So that would be the ego complex that is familiar to us. This is syntonic with our way that we sort of remember ourselves or define ourselves or see ourselves or experience ourselves.
Mm.
So, and then he goes into, for discovery of alchemy, trying to find basically a set of comparative things to what he experienced. So he abandons the black books for a good 4 years. In 1928, when Richard Wilhelm gives him the commentary on the Secret of the Golden Flower, and he sees that there's this, this is almost like origins of synchronicity, because the painting that he made there, one of the last painting, is the Golden Castle that is also in the commentary on the Golden Flower. So he says, oh, there's something in the psyche that has kind of resonances in different cultures. So that's he already thinks about archetypes, so what he calls primordial image, that there are certain that cut across the culture. And this is also, this is the beginnings of sciences, in a way, social sciences. So people want to develop universals, what is the basis that can be shared by many cultures. Anthropology tries to do that. I mean, everybody, who is the beginning of a sort of modern world, they are trying to be precise that this psychology is not a religion, psychology is not sociology, psychology is not metaphysics. I mean, all of that. So they become a little bit stilted in this way. So he wants to be taken seriously as a scientist, empiricist. So
can I just ask one question before we go forward on this, Sylvester? Because there's that big mystery, isn't there, that when Jung was speaking to his anima figure, or the anima figure was speaking to him, rather, and said that what he was doing was art, why did he have a reaction to this? Because it's interesting, isn't it? It's like, was it just the time and he wanted to be known as a scientist, do you think? Or
no, you see,
what was
because that what he calls, someone who studied this and tried to find a confirmation, what was that voice? So he thinks that was Maria Meltzer, which was a nurse at Burgotzli. She was Dutch. She was a heiress of some Dutch distillery fortune, and she was, at that time, Zurich was an interesting place because women could become doctors there, could be nurses in other places in Europe at that time. They couldn't. Wow. So that there was a certain draw for like adventurous, more independent, more suffrage, sort of minded women that would come to Zurich, and so she was one of the characters that is called the white one in the black books, and the black one is Tony Wolff. So when he talks in Memories, Dreams, Reflections about at a certain point, the anima voice told me that, what you are doing, it's art. And he sort of rejects it. This is women's voice. They want to talk, only about opposites. This is science, or in other version, he would say nature. So I'm natural scientist, basically, he is saying. So he, for him, to be with all the controversy about Jung's art and so on that was published in the recent years, at the end of his life, he's misunderstood psychologist. That's how he feels about himself. But misunderstood artist would be a kind of lower value for him. The misunderstood psychologist, I'm still a scientist or whatever, so I'm fine. But misunderstood artist would be like too much. So he would do some process that could be considered artistic, but he would not call it art. So it was only a name that he was objecting to, because he was still doing things, and that were quite artistic. Here, people who studied, he ordered special pigments for the he learned certain kind of techniques with the tempera, how to mix up the egg with pigments. I mean, so he was doing, basically artistic endeavor, or this illustrated manuscript, sort of form medieval style that he published in quite a few, and had some in collections in his library.
Yeah.
But he begins. So he has these dialogues, and then very quickly, because already his essays on the relationship of ego in the unconscious, the first version is 1916, he starts to conceptualize what Sonny Shamdasani calls the psychology project, Jung psychology project. So he takes his experience and then starts to develop from the images and from the figures that he encounters concepts. And he says that the concepts are very empirical, meaning very close related. They're not very abstract. So anima, they would be feminine, the shadow would be, let's say, masculine for the man. So he, then the wise old man, wise old woman. So he will get based on the character that he experienced. So he, in some sense, to some degree, abstracts and creates a sort of the concept out of it. And
Yeah.
then in theory deals with the concept, more or less. Only later on, through the alchemy, when he writes the Mysterium Conjunctionis in particular, he began to appreciate now, and he will begin to call what he before called complexes subpersonalities. So they're like little little people, he calls them.
And here we get back to the boarding house, maybe.
Yeah, that'll be that direction. So Hillman didn't see the Red Book. I mean, when he was doing, let's say, revisioning psychology and so on, so he never, because it was already in the vault. When he got to Zurich, Jung put it somewhere in the closet. So before that, before the 50s, apparently he had it open, in a style of gospel in the church, this kind of little pedestal, and every so often he would bring the patient to show some mostly pictures, and. So there is a full cycle in a way. So he starts with the medium, that there are sort of characters appearing, makes them into complexes. Then, through his own dialogues with these inner figures, who actually he begins to relate in black books as others, as other subjects. They have the different position towards different things, different perspective on what's going on, different perspectives of each other, which is like normal people. You ask them, what do you think about that? And they will tell you something different than you thought. So, and he's a lot of surprise. So he's open. For me, the most amazing things in this sort of the dialogic, with surrealists were doing it at that time. Hermann Hesse did this. They're all kind of experimenting with this form of writing. Something automatic writing, you'd call it, or something like that. The most amazing thing is that through writing, and you as a writer know that by writing, we discovered things that we never thought about. That it's more than we knew. So
it's an opening up.
Yes, it's like an amazing thing that Jung, every so often is astonished what comes up, because he never thought in this way. But obviously, in some sense, it's coming from his psyche, so it's somehow, but it's not conscious knowledge.
Yeah.
So that's an amazing thing that you open up through the process of getting into writing of the new ideas that you've never thought before.
And in a kind of maybe in simple terms, like Philemon, he's opening up to an archaic kind of wisdom, let's say, or whatever, and this something's coming through him which is old, more archaic. And
no, yeah, I mean, here's Elijah, or first, Elijah and Salome and the snake, and then the Elijah sort of, so from Elijah, in a way, Philemon emerges. From Philemon, another two prophets appear, Ha and Ka. So later on in the volume 6 and 7, they become, and they have a very, the Ha is the father of Philemon. You know, the Kai is the shadow of Philemon. I mean, so they are, you know, related in a way, in a kind of sort of family almost resemblance, but they have a different understanding of what's going on. So they're in that sense like real people, and nobody has a whole picture.
Yeah, okay. So maybe is that one of the first things we can say about, you know, if there's this fantasy of a total unity of the psyche, and, you know, back in the New Age days, becoming enlightened and having the whole picture and something like that, that, you know, what you're saying about all of this is
there's a certain image that Jung actually has in the Black Books. At a certain point, when he is just after he leaves, he's at certain point he's committed to the mental asylum.
Yeah.
In his sort of exploration of active imagination, and when he leaves, he enters another door and finds himself in the world of Parzival and the Grail legends. So and there's talking about the now integrity of personality, or, you know, unification. So he looks around and he sees like Klinks, or, you know, and here's I guess Wagnerian version of the Parzival story. So he looks at the Klinks, and he looks like him. He looks at Parzival, and Parzival looks like him. Remember the old movie, Being John Malkovich? There's a scene there. Remember that everybody is John Malkovich when he's sitting in a restaurant, and there are 100 waiter and other you know, patrons are all John Malkovich. You know, so there's this kind of feeling that he is, you know, and even he says that he is becoming one with himself. I am who I am, and he sort of unifies with the person who is sitting at the desk writing, and the Parzival that is now at this point even like communion, or is kneeling, and he sort of fuses himself, as it were, with everything, and becomes one, coming one to himself. So the notion of the unity, and his notion of the self is about this singularity, that somewhere that, you know, and you know, obviously psychiatry sees all kind of disorders of, you know, dissociation at that time and so on, that people, you know, are sort of fragmented in a way. And the good ideal of the thing for the people is that you're the same, you know, when you were yesterday, and basically. Right. So remember the old Heraclitus story, you know, meaning like you cannot step twice into the same river. For, you know, up until I read Pessoa, I always thought about it, okay, you know, obviously there will be different water. So, you know, we are going the next day, and, you know, you step different waters of the river. Maybe the same river is as a kind of concept, but the water will be different. But until I read Pessoa, I never thought about it. It was enough for me to see fluidity of things, for that, you know, sense that the river is never the same. Yeah. But the subject that goes the next day to the river is also changing. So there is a fluidity of the river and fluidity of the you that goes to the river. So it's a double change. You know, maybe the change between yesterday and today, in our experience, is not dramatic, unless something like terrible happens. You know, then you know, the next day is like feeling after, you know, after 9/11 and before 9/11. Yeah. You know, those kind of moments that from day to day you feel different. Yeah. But generally, you know, we say, no, okay, it's pretty much the same. Yeah. You know, in the kind of sense, you know, internal sense of ourselves. But Pessoa is beautiful in just differentiating this minutia, not just multiplicity of others, which is fine. You know, the world is 8 billion people, you know, a lot, you know, and the animals and what have you, but multiplicity of the I, of the subject. So let me give a little poem by Ricardo Reis, who is one of the heteronyms of Pessoa. He is a medical doctor, a royalist, monarchist. So when the Portugal becomes a republic, he goes on voluntary exile to Brazil. Right. So he's writing as he's from Brazil. As you do. Yeah. So he is, you know, so this is called Countless Lives in Habitas. Countless lives in Habitas. I don't know When I think or feel, who is thinking or feeling? I am merely the place where things are thought or felt. I have more than just one soul. There are more I's than I myself. I exist nevertheless, indifferent to them all. I silence them, I speak, crossing urges of what I feel or do not feel, struggle with who I am, but I ignore them. They dictate nothing to the I know. I write. So if you
Sylvester, just for 1 second. Yeah, can we go back 1 second? So we're leading into Pessoa, right? And can you just give a little bit of background? Because as I understand it, he wasn't really that well known, and then he died. And then they found these trunks of poetry and writing that came from so many different personalities. That's right, isn't it? And then, so he was writing from all these different figures.
So he is a Portuguese writer. He was born in 1888, 13 years after Jung.
Yeah.
Portuguese language, so it's like it's not even Spanish, so not too many people. Brazilians obviously speak because of the colony and stuff. But so Portuguese is not well known. And Portugal, in the time when he's born, is kind of a backward European country. So there's, they are behind the Industrial Revolution, just starting there, so they lost the empire, they lost Brazil mostly and some Indonesia, India, Goa. So they're becoming poor. Yeah. In a way. So he's in that sort of the decline. This is the decline. Pessoa. Richard Zenith, who started, I guess, reading his biography, considered Pessoa as a kind of double foreigner, because he is, at 5, when his father died and his, that newborn brother dies of tuberculosis, his mother falls in love with a sailor, with a captain, and eventually, when he's 7, he moves with his mother to Natal, which is a British colony of South Africa of that time, to Durban, where his father becomes a Portuguese consul to the British colony, and so he is taken from the Portuguese language, and first he's thrown into a French school, and then into English school, and he's obviously very smart, a little boy. And learn French, learn English very well. He's like a best student of English, actually, begins to write poems in English already. And, and he doesn't have too many friends. So he makes his own friends. I mean, he says, make some friends. So he basically makes the little figures and makes them friends, and has an inner friends. A lot of kids have imaginary friends. Yeah. So when he talks about, how he developed heteronyms, kind of in an evolutionary sense, he said, I never lost capacity that every child have to have imaginary friends. I actually made more of them. And when I was an adolescent, I would make even more. So he, as a kid, he writes the whole newspaper with 20 different characters, poets and journalists and political commentaries. I mean, he distributed to his family, already 20 different things. When he's 5 years old, he just learned to write, and he has already characters, Chevalier de Pas, which is an interesting name because it's a chevalier of nothing in French. So this character writes letters to little Fernando, and sort of he, that already started that. And there's another Captain Thibault, and he brings when eventually his mother marries and has kids with, so his stepsister and stepbrothers, he includes them as a younger ones to participate in his fantasy. Which is also common, if you look at, Brenton sisters in England, they have a whole fantasy life. So his half siblings are playing with his worlds as well, and they participate in. So there's some kind of play acting in it. And then he writes a lot of different things, and events. So he loses touch pretty much with Portuguese. At 17, he returns back to Portugal, and he's foreigner there for the second time now.
Yeah.
And he writes for the first 3 years, from 1907 to 1910, mostly in English in Portugal. Only in 1910 he starts to go back to and still write in English. He wrote 35 Shakespearean poems that were so good, and he sent them to major British publications at that time, and they rejected it because they were too much Shakespearean language. You know, nobody talks like that, I would say to him. But because obviously he learned from not from speaking, but from writing. So he has this proclivity to, you know, and then he develops different characters, you know, Robert Anon, who has a brother who translates from English into Portuguese. So, you know, he writes a lot of things. He at tender age of 20, he writes his version of Faust, called Fausto, in which he basically the inner world of Faust. It's his fantasies and thinking. So he writes another kind of play, but there's no action in his plays. It's called Mariner, and basically he calls it play with people, not with drama. So the heteronym, and he talks later on in life about heteronyms, how they develop, they basically see drama in people. Yeah. So it's not interaction on the stage among the characters, but a kind of vertical thing. So here's, you know, and you may know the essay, Hillman wrote a beautiful essay called Pseudologia Fantastica, about sort of psychiatric condition to invent stories that never took place. And a lot of artists do that. So Pessoa has his own mythologizing, if you wish, and Hillman talks about it in terms of a daimon. The daimon, the sort of creative force within of what the Romans called the genius, is creating the story. So it's not about what factually have happened. In some sense, also Jung's MDR is like that. It's sort of Jung perception of things. It's not actually the factographic things are not so important. So in Pseudologia Fantastica, Hillman talks about this sort of natural tendency to mythologize one's own life. Yeah. And so what Pessoa says on the day of March 8 in 1914, I stood up by my standing desk, and suddenly a flow came up, and I wrote 30-something poems of the keeper of sheep. Alberto Caeiro, the master, manifested itself in me. And then, in response to the master, Fernando Pessoa wrote 6 poems of slanting rain, with oblique rain, in response to this. And then another characters appeared, Álvaro de Campos, who started to write this sort of futuristic, magnificent, kind of tremendous, depictions of the modern world machinery, that sort of style. And then another more kind of classical, poet appears, Ricardo Reis, that starts to write odes in style of Horace from the ancient Rome. So these are sort of, Zenith, as you read, he looks at these things, and it happens with this period of couple of weeks. It didn't happen like on one day. Pessoa noted different dates on different poems, so it wasn't happening like that. But in 2 weeks, this tremendous upheaval of the very original poetry took place. Nietzsche wrote Zarathustra in 3 spares of the 10 days each. There's like 400 pages of the very original kind of form. Rilke had his own Duino elegies or sonnet to Orpheus also coming up like very spontaneously so in him, so what Pessoa, so when you look at black books, Jung, there's a subject that is called Jung. What I call Jung's eye is there, and this Jung's eye has dialogue with different eyes, with different, so there will be Salome eye, there will be Elijah eye. They all have first-person singular perspective, and they interact with Jung, and in the process, Jung I changes, and some of them changes as well. Like the red one, for example, and and others. But the difference here is that when we think about these characters, we move to the third person very quickly. So it's like Elijah is obviously has a name, so it's he is appearing, he's an old prophet, somehow related to the Old Testament or the Torah, and Salome is that Salome that is from John the Baptist, and we talk about it as a third person. When actually when they appear as a first person subject. So what Pessoa does for his exploration, he at certain points talk about, we have from the As You Like It, from Shakespeare, all the world is a stage and we are merely players. So Pessoa depersonalizes himself as a stage in a way, and these different characters, the countless eyes that appear, they become characters on the stage. So in order to write as a Alberto Caeiro, as a keeper of sheep, the Pessoa has to retreat in a way and give the writing capacity or speaking capacity to Alberto Caeiro. So he depersonalizes himself, which Jung does the same thing. In order to write in another character for that moment, the Jung eye has to stop it and then go. And sometimes it gets confused. So there are some dialogues that Jung loses it. Meaning like the character is talking so fast, it seems that Jung, sort of makes mistakes, so has to cross out because it's like different things, have happened in a way, or he sort of the process is too fast.
And just at the same, at the same kind of period, it's like Jung, the kind of psychological genius is having these experiences, and Pessoa, the kind of poetic genius, is having all these and all.
No, but you talk about the trunk. You see, Pessoa in his life published very little. There was this avant-garde. This was a cafe culture in all over Europe. So, the Lisbon had its own coffee houses, and Pessoa was quite well known among the sort of avant-garde artists of the time. So there were these magazines like Athena or Orpheus that had maybe 2-3 editions, because they ran out of money very quickly. He tried to make publishing house for some inheritance, but went back up very quickly. So his friends knew some of his poems, but not many others, because these things had a circulation of 100 or 500 or something like that. They very quickly disappeared. So he wrote and wrote. He lived in writing, if you wish. He, that time he also, that was a coffee culture, but not only coffee. He liked his heavy, different brandies and whatever. So at night he would sit, smoke, and drink and write.
But he wasn't necessarily telling the world that he had all this stuff, was he?
No. He, every so often something would be published. He published some poems of Caeiro, the keeper of sheep, during the lifetime, and he only published, strangely, during Salazar regime. One of his former sort of pupils, in a way, became a kind of propaganda chief of the Salazar fascistic Portuguese version, and he published his collection of poems called The Message. That is a kind of more sort of when the subject of the poem is really Portugal. Portugal as this sort of declining country, and he has Pessoa had this great fantasy of the Fifth Empire, like that would be rising. So the glory of the old, sort of the conquistador Portugal would come back, in the 20th century or so. He would be sort of thinking about Sebastian. There was a king who disappeared in 16th century, so that he will, like the hidden imam in the Shia tradition, would at some point they will reappear. So this Sebastian will come out and lead Portugal to its new glory or something. So and
not everyone would have liked that side.
But he was able to, in a sense, if we recognize within himself a certain, we could call, feeling tone, to use Jung. Okay, that this is, I feel like Caeiro is coming.
Yeah.
So Caeiro is a peasant, basically. He has like only nine grade education, so he writes very simply. He lives in the countryside, and he dies in 1915. However, there are some poems of his that were written in 1920s and so on. So his ghost, yes, it's right, this poetry. And there is a beautiful book by José Saramago, the contemporary, Portuguese writer, a year in life of Ricardo Reis, which is a beautiful taking. So when Pessoa bodily leaves the earth on 1935 on the 30th of November, the other heteronyms that never had a body, they are still alive. So Ricardo Reis gets a letter from some friend of Pessoa that Pessoa died. He's in Brazil. So he takes a transatlantic ship to get there. And he gets there, this is Saramago version, he gets there in like, somewhere after Christmas or whatever, in 1935. And actually Pessoa meets him as a ghost. And so he has a dialogue with Pessoa. Now, the Ricardo Reis is the one who is alive, and Pessoa is sort of that ghost that sort of is there. So you have a, how in a sense, how the things live after the death of the person. How Jung is alive. He died in 1961, and still, Jung is living for the people who devote their life to study him. And even in the whole, there's a Shakespearean controversy in the last 20, 30 years, who was Shakespeare, It'd be William Shakespeare, maybe it was Francis Bacon, or maybe some aristocrat was doing it, because how this little guy from Avon could know all this stuff, he didn't have also university education, it seems, so what? So Shakespeare himself becomes a problematic character, but the figures of Hamlet or the Macbeth or King Lear are as solid as ever.
Living on.
I mean, they are more of the, so what Pessoa calls them actually Shakespeare heteronyms. Because one beauty of Shakespeare is that he is able to find the voice of the character.
Yeah.
So Hamlet speaks Hamlet voice that is distinct from any other character.
So what does this mean? You're a clinical psychologist, Sylvester. What does it mean for the people you see, the people that come along to therapy? Well, I mean, what is all this saying? I mean, one thing I get from immediately is that to get involved in the creative process, there's a bit of a submission in a way, this thing of opening the channel, maybe I would get from what you're saying, and that, is it us? Are we having the dream, or is the dream having us? And being open more to what's coming.
In a dream, we know that we are in the world that is around us. The dream ego or dream I is only one character among many others, and the whole world is being created around it. So we are in the psyche. The I in a dream is surrounded, and then I wake up and I had a dream. I mean, this is complete misnomer. Even French would say, I see the dream, In other cultures, there's no possessiveness. But here, the generally English ego, let's say, immediately claims that I had a dream. When dream had me, actually, when I kept with the nightmare, I mean, definitely I didn't have it. It had me to the point that I was terrified. So it is this sort of, it starts early on when the child has a nightmare. The mother comes to comfort, says, "Oh, it was just a dream." So it's like the valuing that world is that somehow meaning the dream is not real. So there's a reality, and these other things have a different dimension. So when Henri Corbin, the French, sort of scholar of Sufi mysticism, and she, sort of tradition of the 11th, 12th, 13th century of, Shuravadi and Avicenna, and Ibn Arabi comes into Eranos, Jung is exposed to him already. Hillman starts to come and see also Corbin, and Corbin has the notion of mundus imaginalis, the sort of imaginal, he calls the imaginal world. So for Sufis, there's material world, there's spiritual world, and they're both real. Spirit is real in different sense that the matter is real, and then there's this third world that is world of imagination, and it's real. It's a different reality, but it's real. In the same sense that the material world is real, but it's they interact with each other. I mean, you can see if you go to contemporary physics, the duality of the particle and the wave is there. So it's like things are not as basically all this thing is empty space from the physics perspective. It's a vibration. Everything is electromagnetic sort of forms that are, and when they look at the atomic structure, it's like empty space between the electron and and the nucleus somewhere. So this is this is creation of our perceptual apparata. Different senses that create this, in some sense, illusion among this, that first of all we are separate. That sort of with Descartes and the objects and subjects and so on, and then that somehow we are the only alive, and the other things are just things,
part of the dead world.
Yeah,
or
so
the building blocks or something.
So this Ricardo Reis, going to Pessoa for a moment, is a pagan. So he is very much into actually has a whole philosophy of polytheism. So he believes in multiplicity of gods, and talks at a certain point that Jesus is just one of like any other gods, like the way it's treated in Hinduism. Jesus comes in and it's not the only sort of the son of God or whatever. He's just like any other character, like another avatar of Vishnu would be, in this. But the Hillman is interesting here. So there's like a little thing in his introduction to the second edition of Revisionist Psychology that he did in 1992, I believe. He says, the fiction of me. So with regard to, he has whole issue with what he calls imaginal ego. And you talk about being porous, being sort of the being able to take things in from the conscious and unconscious, that to not being like solid, and being basically closed off, or the sort of closed-minded in a way, as we would say. To be open to let imagination guide you and claim. So what you ask about the clinical aspect, or the clinical psychologist, which is it's a strange sort of profession, if you wish, because I don't recognize clinic. First of all, it's an analytic. Clinic is, we don't have clinic. Clinics are more related to medical model for me. It's more analytic. And in this format, you begin to see everything as a process. These are processes of identity, processes of interaction with other processes. So you're not so stuck onto definition of this is the I, that this is the person. It's like you basically begin to see fluidity, and when you listen to the process, when person describes their, so let's say, daily experience, you can see moments when every sentence is an I did this, I did that, or something. You could see that there are different I's. That at a certain point it would be, and there's a point. So what just happened here? You can point out the person that is speaking in the first person sentence, but it's already something shifted. You can hear a different inflection. That it's like a different subject comes in. But it being confused because of the it's everything is I, but it's, so the Pessoa has, because of his kind of very precise I would say analysis of the subjectivity of the subject itself. So he go. I mean, you know from the Arthur Rimbaud, when Rimbaud says I is another, he commits the grammatic syntactic error. He doesn't say I am another. He says I is another. So it's beginning of separation, and poets are the first, as usually, from the I as an immediate identification. I am this I that I say I am, versus I is. So the I has it's almost its own agenda, if you wish. So you begin to separate from the I-ness of things and begin to see the contents that come into that I, that is almost like an holder, as this sort of stage on which any sort of player will appear, if depending on the play. So that kind of because of the precision of differentiation that Pessoa does, it's easier to see that. Not only to see, because when what is a complex when it's actually manifests itself in the person will be talking as themselves in a, let's say, different tone with different emotion, and they will be animated in certain way, but it will be always in the first person singular. So I will be feeling that I'm describing something or emoting something as an I. Not that the complex came to me, not the third person, it would be first person. The analyst may hear it that this is different. This is, you have your mother complex came, something like that. But it will come always as a first person singular. So that's another thing. So it's phenomenologically closer to the manifestation in experience when you look at the multiplicity of the subject I.
Do you have some other things from Pessoa that you'd like to read? Meaning,
we need to touch. There's one poem from the Alberto Caeiro, the master, who is Richard Zenith has a little essay on the Alberto Caeiro as a Zen master. That because he said the simplicity and the not going to abstractions, just being in the simple generic language is the tree, is not an oak or beech or the tree. So this is poem 9 from the Keeper of Sheep. And Keeper of Sheep is interesting because this is the herd, and this is has a resonance of the I'm the shepherd, the Jesus as a shepherd of the flock of the, so that's the keeper of sheep. So I'm a keeper of sheep. The sheep are my thoughts, and each thought a sensation. I think with my eyes and my ears, and with my hands and feet, and with my nose and mouth. I think to think a flower is to see and smell it. To eat a fruit is to know its meaning. That's why on a hot day, when I enjoy it so much I feel sad, I lie down in the grass and close my warm eyes. Then I feel my whole body lying down in reality. I know the truth and I am happy. Well, very simple. I mean, it's like, really, it's all about sensation, no abstraction. It just close. So the whole series of the sort of 30-some poems of the Keeper of Sheep are on that kind of basically celebration of sensation of the moment. Kind of like, in some sense, Zen to be here now, kind of, in the.
He's like someone at this time, so he's bringing some kind of message, isn't he, with his genius of openness.
So I mean, we didn't get to the trunk. So when he dies, I guess one of his nephews or whatever discovered in his apartment this huge, like a wooden trunk, as people used to hold like a bridal gown or something, full of papers. It's like close to 30,000 documents that that it's starting like in the 70s, started to be cataloged. The National Library of Portugal acquires it. Then the Fondazione Pessoa starts in the 80s, I believe. Then when the computers come in, it's like in the 90s, it starts to be digitized. So you have Arquivo Pessoa now in Portuguese online. Still is being, not yet fully digitized there. And then translations start to come into different languages because not too many people speak Portuguese. So Richard Zenith is one of the English translators, and now he lives actually in Lisbon, and he's one of the custodian of the archives himself. So so what they discover in this trunk is not only this poems that were published, maybe 100 of them were published, and then there's like hundreds of other other material, the whole philosophies, the whole psychiatry. Even there's a psychiatrist that is there. There's Antonio Mora, who is a mental patient, who writes about polytheism and paganism from the mental asylum. There are astrologers. There are sort of the whole bodies of initiation, so the secret societies of the different characters that sort of the stages of deeper initiation that Pessoa sort of wrote. Whether he developed them, we don't know. So he is, and then there's a thing that was never published that becomes a book of disquiet. So there's another two characters, Vicente Guedes and then Bernardo Soares, who write this really postmodern novel of sorts, which are basically fragments. And I like the way I think Zenith talks about that these are ruins. These fragments are ruins, but they were never buildings that were built that became ruins. They started as ruins. So there's a reverse of the chronology, if you wish. We receive from antiquity is ruins of something that was glorious, but these things are kind of ruins as they come into being. And the book of Disquiet is probably the most articulate depiction of the most difficult emotional states, with the ability to articulate in language horrors and despairs that most of the time when people feel that, they're speechless. The language is gone. So Bernardo Soares has a capacity to render despair with the precision, with the poetry, with and you still feel despair, but it's very elaborate, if you wish, linguistically, that can touch you for that. So to be able to go into these states and then linguicize them, so to speak, it's remarkable, So in terms now clinically, so I recommend my students to read that, to get into to experience certain things that the patients are not even able to describe, or even themselves in our states, that we get into empty things that you cannot articulate anything, So
yeah, that's good.
So Jung and multiplicity. So there's a character named Ka in the later part of Black Books. He is a kind of a prophet. He gave the runes to the Ha that brings runes to Jung. And Ka has its own sort of vision of what's happening in the psyche. And he talks a lot about multiplicity of the eye. That the eye, he used the metaphor of the tree. The tree is the eye. The branches are the eye, the leaves are the eye, every cell in the leaf is an eye. So the kind of the vision of subjectivity is alive in every fiber of being, in a way, that it's all subjectivity. Pessoa has visions, in Bernardo Soares' words, that, we'll all love, a lot of us love Van Gogh. Landscape of Van Gogh, and people talk, critics and analyze his painting, that it's a subjective vision of nature and so on. So we look at the midnight night, or the fields of wheat and we see basically Van Gogh. This is Van Gogh psyche somehow, melted with nature. So Ares has a vision of landscape. So so whenever we talk about anything, we talk about ourselves. A simple, we on one level we know it, but on the other level, it's like to be able to kind of to see it moment by moment, that these are the landscape of life, of the whole cosmos that we experience is actually my cosmos. When I talk about the end of the world, when the world is coming, it's the end of my world is coming, really. And how I perceive that world, so there's a lot of traversing in the inner landscape.
So it's like when Hillman says literalism is or it seems to me literalism is the enemy for Hillman.
Yeah, no, that would be, yeah. So but also necessity. So given that we are in a sort of Christian, Judeo-Christian Islamic world when there's single God, so I think that's the one issue that we take, that the subject is singularity. The I am, and like God is, I'm made in the image of God, so I am one like God is. God is in three sort of persons, so there's a funny poem in the Keeper of Sheep that if you find sometime, when Pessoa, Caeiro talks about little Jesus, baby Jesus that comes from the heaven to the earth, and what happens, so in some sense, what God has a heteronym. So when he, as a bush, says, "I am who I am," he generates Jesus in a way for Mary, but Jesus is of the same substance as God is, the same the dove, the Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit is also God, but so God is in Trinity in a form. So these are like heteronyms of the same form. I mean, you have this. You've seen, Hindu sculptures of, many heads, Vishnus, next to another. So they usually have actually one body on it. They may have many hands,
many arms, or many heads.
So there are many eyes in a way, many heads on a single form.
Which is also that idea of the scintilla, the scintilla, yeah.
Tiny kind of like the cell that has consciousness. So in the alchemical Jung begins to consider that it's not only that the ego complex is the center of consciousness, but everything in the unconscious, every scintilla has a consciousness. So he's going back to his exploration of blank books at the end, recognizing that everything has consciousness. It's not only the usual subject, the I, And a lot of, particularly in psychology, there a lot of damage been done, at least in English-speaking countries, for translation of Freud. Freud talks about S, which is it, Ich, which is I, and Über-Ich, which is the superego. So translation of Starkey of it as id, the ish, which is I, really, into ego, and then superego as a Über-Ich, it moved it from the subject. So in German, it functions as I. The ego doesn't enter Freud. So it becomes more reified. That's like, I can talk about my ego, which is an oxymoron. The I, it's always an I. It's always I as a subject in the moment constituting itself. It's not some kind of the third person ego that somehow, I am egoistic or whatever you could say. But it's I think that's, and then the ego psychology came on it, because you have to develop strong, what Hillman calls Herculean ego. That's the ideal, that you're able to destroy all the emotional monsters and so on, like the 12 labors of Hercules or such things.
And in a way, I mean, this is what you're really speaking about, isn't it? Is getting away from that naive, heroic ego or ego psychology, or and moving into this wider, broader.
No, so at a certain point in the letters of Freud to Wilhelm Fliess, which is early collaborator that they separated as often with Freud because he is this sort of patriarch and cannot tolerate other authority. Yeah. But he says in one letter that I am not a man of science, but I am a conquistador. I have temperament of conquistador, and he talks about conquering other territories. So it's like this is the unconscious is terra incognita. So when the conquistador come to Mexico, they sort of, this is this is our land. We take it over. There are some others living, but they're not quite human, unless we sort of convert them into Christianity. They don't even have soul. So so it is the same approach. That you conquer this territory. The idea for the id to become a subject, to become an ego. So where the id was, ego shall be, but that's again because of this translation is strange. In original is where it was, I shall be. So when the Lacan comes in, he adds to it that so basically the relationship of two subjects. It is the other subject, and the I is a subject. So it's a discourse of subjects. It's not a conquista that I can can do with the unconscious whatever. And we have this sort of jargonic way that people talk about. I want to tap into the unconscious and like you get it out, sort of like the way you tap into natural resources, and destroy half of the planet. I mean, the same, the attitude of the capitalist ego that wants to use everything as resources is the same attitude that the ego psychology has towards the unconscious.
Right. So in simple terms, in my terms, from the ego to the soul. And the soul is a very large boarding house indeed.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And three geniuses, Jung, Hillman, Pessoa.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good place to leave it there today, Sylvester, and I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everything that you've shared.
Thank you. Thank you, John.